All right, so we're back with some additional news on what's happening at the climate conference, the COP26. Two things primarily that has happened now. First one is there's a draft agreement which has been criticized for not being ambitious enough, which is entirely expected as the countries haven't made pledges enough to get us where we supposedly need to go. So where are we at currently? According to Climate Tracker, the current draft and the current set of pledges will take us to about 2.4 degrees centigrade over pre-industrial levels, which I would say still is fairly good. Compared to where we were a decade ago, this is definitely moving in the right direction. A couple of more climate negotiations, and we might actually get somewhere. To put this into perspective, what is being promised? So we are talking about decarbonization, we're talking about switching energy systems, transport sectors. Still, where we're at now is that we're looking towards a continued increase in emissions for the coming years, with over 13% increase in emissions by 2030 are expected, but still then eventually tapering out and moving downwards if pledges are to be kept. We'll see about that. And also one thing that is in there, which is an urge to start phasing out subsidies for fossil fuels. Subsidies. So there are still subsidies for fossil fuel use in large parts of the world. So governments pay part of the bill for fossil fuel use, which is incredible in this day. Also on that note, which isn't in that agreement, but it's worth mentioning that we also still have incredibly high subsidies for animal farming in large parts of the world, in EU and in the US, which is responsible for another large chunk of the emissions. And that's not even discussed yet. Within the transition of the food industry, there is still a lot of subsidies going into the status quo, keep on producing the food the way that we have for a long time, that we know is part of the climate problem. Well, there has been this statement of a joint agreement between the US and China. This is potentially really, really big, because if you look at sort of the dynamics in these climate negotiations, you have a few different parts of the world. EU is the good guy in class, and out of the superpower regions, the US and China know that EU will sign on to anything, will do whatever it takes. The US and China are really, really wary as to what the other one's going to do. No one wants to do more than the other because that may cause economic disadvantage. So these superpowers agreeing on reducing emissions is really, really big. And then that is potentially a really strong step forward, promising towards getting the rest of the world to follow suit. So this can really lead somewhere. We'll see where that goes, because there are a lot of fundamental disagreements and mistrust between these nations. Also in there is a promise from China to start phasing out coal in the time span 2026 to 2030. And here the wording is important. Start phasing out. Does not mean phasing out in this time span. It means that they might start phasing out in 26, or they might wait until 2030 before they start phasing out. So this is clearly not enough to get to the climate levels that we want to go, but it's still an important step. And hopefully for the next COP, this will move closer and closer in time. Another not so big thing that happened, but is worth mentioning, is that a group of countries phase out fossil fuel vehicles by 2040. So this is not the biggest countries in the world, so it's not major on the global scale of emissions, but it's a clear indicator of where this is going. We are going to phase out fossil fuels, and also back to the dynamics, getting rid of all the emissions. We need the US, China, and also the developing world to follow and get rid of their emissions. But to get there, it's important to have these test markets where we can develop the technology that will solve the problem. And knowing that there are countries that will phase out fossil fuel vehicles entirely means that there is definitely a market for electric vehicles. Well, we knew that already, they're already driving on the street, but that creates space for companies to develop electrification for vehicles in this case. And we can expect to see the same thing in the food segment, where we will get markets that, ahead of everywhere else, will start introducing policies to force emissions to go away, and there we can develop products for these markets. Of course, whenever that happens, you have some smaller countries moving first, and then when the rest of the world can see that you can lead a perfectly nice and happy and rich life without causing emissions, it's easier to copy and follow suit.